Hello, and thank you for joining us on the Ask Andrew show, Canada's first Facebook live streaming question and answer show. My name is Andrew Feldstein, and I'm the principal of Feldstein Family Law Group. We're a GTA family law firm with offices in Markham, Vaughan, Oakville, and Mississauga. Both myself and our entire firm practices exclusively in the area of family law. And today on the show, we're having special guest Joanna Seidel. She's the clinical director of Toronto Family Therapy and Mediation. She's a registered social worker and accredited family mediator. She established her practice in Toronto in 2006 and has since expanded her practice to which currently provides a range of services specializing in counseling for individuals and families, particularly in the context of divorce and separation. And welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Okay, so today we're talking about perspectives on parental alienation and reintegration therapy. Unfortunately, it's not an uncommon occurrence in separations that we see one parent being left estranged from one child to all of their children. And how do you deal with that when that happens?
Well, I think these families are very complex. And I think, one way you can deal with that is providing reunification therapy, which is a family therapeutic intervention that focuses on rebuilding the relationship between a child and a parent when they're having contact problems and a child is resisting spending time with that parent or having a relationship with that parent.
So I heard you say rebuilding when there's problems in contacts between the child and the parent. So I'm going to start with, there seems to be a problem, as I see it in the law right now, that children are given far more discretion than they should have, and social workers rules of professional conduct in terms of treating children when they don't want to participate in the process. So at what age do you look to a child to say, if they don't want to be here, then there's nothing I can do and I can't help?
Well, I think that answer is also very complex because it's not our job to force a child or even an adolescent into therapy. It's the parent's job to use their parental authority and their responsibility and their duties as a parent to have the child attend therapy. And this is a topic that I cover at the beginning of reunification therapy all the time, because the parents really need to use their parenting functioning just as they would to send a child to school or to send a child to the dentist or for them to receive their vaccines, right? They use their parenting functioning for the child to attend all of those places because it's important for their health and well-being. Well, having a relationship with both parents is also crucial and essential for their health and overall well-being.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more, but the problem that happens is all too often, one parent, especially in the course of the litigation, will say, my 11-year-old child says they don't want to go to reunification therapy and I can't get them to go. That's a common theme I hear. And I'm hearing social workers, even if I got a court order saying the child has to go and the parent says, I can't get the child going. And then if the child shows up and the child says, I don't want to be here, I'm hearing social workers saying, well, we're not going to treat the child because the child doesn't want to be here.
Right. It is a really tough situation, right? Because therapists or social workers or anyone registered with their college, they are committed to do no harm, right? They want the child to come in peacefully or they could be distressed, but they want, the parents to help manage that stress. So, I do think that therapists can definitely make a difference and can see these children. But we work together as a team with the parent, with both parents, right? So both parents are there in the room supporting the child as they go through a therapeutic process.
I guess where I'm seeing it from the perspective of a family law lawyer who's acted for parents who are not seeing one or more of their children, and we obtain the order for reunification therapy, and the other parent undermines it. And when they do, I'm often hearing social workers say to me, well, the child doesn't want to be here. They're 13 years old. They've told me they don't want to be here. And the other parent may be giving lip service or may be sitting in your room saying, well, you got to be here, but they really aren't. I mean, how do you manage that? Because before we get into even having the discussion of reintegration therapy, I want to understand how you manage the difficult situation when the child doesn't want to be there, and perhaps the parent who has the relationship isn't supporting the reintegration therapy. How do you manage that to get the child into the process so the child will be there? Because as a lawyer, my problem is I go get an order for reintegration therapy. I spend a whole ton of my clients' money to get that order. And then they're frustrated when the child basically at most shows up once and says, I don't want to be here.
Well, the remedy is really on that parent to really encourage the child to be there. And the court may have case management and oversight in that way, right? I mean, so the therapist needs to respond to the child. It's the therapist's job to create a safe therapeutic environment, to respond to the child with empathy and reassurance and support. But again, it lies on the parent because I mean, what is the therapist supposed to do? Go into the car and say, you need to come into my office and participate in therapy? That's very unlikely it's going to happen. It's very unlikely we're going to shift the landscape of all these therapists out there to do that. Again, so I can't say this more and more. The responsibility, the duty relies on the parent.
Okay. And I guess I'm seeing it from the litigation perspective of, okay, so you take 13, 14, I'm trying to go younger, maybe 13, 12, 11 even. The child doesn't want to show up. And you give me the example of not going to the car. Okay, I get why you're not doing that. That makes sense to me. But then we're left in the quagmire of what options are there from a litigation standpoint with for the parent who's not seeing the child, the other parent is paying lip service or maybe not even paying lip service because the only real remedy of going to court are challenging remedies as a lawyer. Because one, I don't see a court necessarily, because this is very rare, where they take the child and put the child in the other parent's home. And what are your feelings of a court doing that when the child clearly doesn't even want to see the parent or even speak to that parent?
Well, I think that's the last case resort, right? That's the last resort. But in hope, the hope is that the judge can come up with a step up plan, right? That says this needs to happen after 4 weeks. This needs to happen after 8 weeks. This needs to happen after 12 weeks. And if we're not meeting these goals, what's the next step?
Okay.
Right. And the next step is what you're talking about, which may be, a blackout period or a custody reversal. But I think that we as mental health professionals and lawyers and judges, we need to come up with those step up plans, and the court needs to really reinforce them because that's giving everybody the opportunity to heal.
Okay.
Right.
I couldn't agree more, but I find at least what I'm seeing lately, the hardest part with reunification therapy is simply getting the child to go, and the courts are becoming more and more reluctant to make an order because of the scenario where a parent says, well, I'm trying to get the child to go. The child doesn't want to go. And the social workers are saying, well, if they don't want to be here, we can't help them. And that's sort of the quagmire that I'm seeing lately that's really problematic. I mean, I've seen it a lot worse in the last couple of years where I can think of at least 4 or 5 clients that have wanted to start the reintegration therapy. The other parent hasn't been supportive. And it breaks down because then they don't want to go back to court and get an order that they're in breach. Now, it may be that there's a change in the rules that's taken place very recently that allows a court, without having a finding of someone being in contempt, to have financial consequences for breaching that court order. And maybe that's the toolbox that judges will need going forward to say, if your 12-year-old child doesn't show up at the reintegration therapy, that's on you, mom or dad, to go back to you saying, what happens with school? When a child says, we don't want to go to school in the morning, that's not an option. And really, the reintegration therapy should be similarly treated by the court in terms of the parent who has the relationship taking the child there.
So I couldn't agree with you more that this problem keeps growing and growing, and we definitely need to find some solutions. The one thing I want to point out is as a therapist, I really want to understand why. Why is that child refusing a relationship with that parent, right? Does the child have justified reasons, right? Was the parent abusive? Was the parent not around or absent from the child's life? Those are some important points that we need to look at about why the child is resisting. And those points are called like justified rejection, right? When the children have a justified reason not to want to have contact or not to want to participate in therapy with that parent. But the other side is that if that child had a loving, caring, and meaningful relationship with a parent prior to the separation, then that is a huge red flag that something needs to happen.
Well, I think you're entirely correct with what you're saying there, because I see, when you call it justified, usually you're not going to get the court order for the reunification therapy when it is justified, because the other side is going to oppose the reunification therapy by saying, well, we don't want to go to reunification therapy because the child is terrified of them.
Mm-hmm.
He or she has been abusive, has been brutal, has done all these horrible things, and they're going to lay it out. That's going to get a court to be concerned versus, I always remember once I was on a motion and the mom was saying, dad shouldn't be able to see the child because the child watches too many movies with dad and has too many hot dogs. And the court was like, okay, so dad shouldn't get every other weekend because the food isn't right.
Mm-hmm.
And, the food should be right. I'm not going to minimize that, but which is worse? No dad
Right.
in the child's life, or a little bit of unhealthy food when the child doesn't have any health issues? To
Well,
me,
I
that's
mean,
pretty obvious.
right. And no parent is perfect, right? And we don't go and knock on the doors of, intact homes and families who remain together and say, you're not feeding your child right, or they're having too much McDonald's these days, right? Or too many hot dogs. So, another parent shouldn't be screened with those kinds of, with those kinds of principles in place, right? Like everybody should have some autonomy in parenting as long as it's not harmful to
And,
a
I-
child.
and I'm giving that as an example because when a child may be echoing, well, mommy or daddy doesn't feed me right, so I don't want to go to mommy or daddy's, that's a great example of right out of the gate, it's not justified why the child is resisting, and that the kind of work that you do and other social workers do may be critical of getting the child back on the path. Now, what we've talked about so far is getting the child there, which is sometimes I think probably the most challenging aspect of the work, at least at my end, is getting the children there. Then once I'm able to get that court order and hopefully have the child attend with you, what happens in the process when they're actually in your office and now you're seeing them? How do you go about trying to fix these kind of very real and sad problems?
Well, first of all, you need a really good therapist in the child's corner, in the family's corner, one that's skilled and has training in high conflict separation and divorce and parent-child contact problems, right? So we need skilled therapists out there. And I think that there's so many different ways that, you can intervene, right? And a lot of it is education. A lot of it is co-parenting work and education before even involving the child and assessing the nature of the contact problem. Why is the child resisting contact with a parent? Again, is it for reasonable reasons? Are they justified? Or are they unreasonable? Is the child having disproportionate fear or hostility or anger towards a parent for nonsensical, non-substantial reasons? So once we have a good landscape and a good picture of the family dynamic, that which is kind of the assessing phase, which we call the clinical intake consultation or the family consultation, then we begin by seeing treating the whole family system systemically, right? We need the whole family's involvement to help support the family and help the child and the estranged or alienated parent rebuild. And so what comes, there's so many different remedies, but what may come from that is parent-child sessions with forgiveness and healing and, awareness and forgiveness around mistakes in mind, right? It may come with parent education for the preferred parent, that if they are influencing the child negatively, it can have long-term harmful consequences on their overall well-being and on their future relationships. And it may come with the alienated parent to help the alienated parent respond effectively to children who are resisting them. So there's so many different steps, and a therapist really needs to thoroughly examine what's going on in the family and come up with a plan.
Okay, so I heard a few things. So number one, I heard a child may reasonably resist the other parent. So what do you do in that scenario where they have a reason? Maybe the parent acknowledges they had an addiction issue, as an example, and now they're over the addiction issue. They're ready to be a parent, and the child has legitimate reasons why they don't want to be around that parent that had the addiction issues.
Well, I think that again, that involves the entire family to participate in a healing process. So maybe the child needs education around addiction, right? And substance abuse, for example. And maybe a child needs to mature to understand that. And so we need to give that child patience and time to grow. Maybe the parent needs to really acknowledge some of the behaviors that that parent caused that was hurtful for the child, right? And really take responsibility. And maybe the other parent needs to also be on board with forgiveness and healing, because parents make mistakes all of the time. Nobody's perfect. And we can't always focus on the mistakes that people make, but we need to focus on the effort that they put in afterwards and the life lessons that these mistakes teach us. So if we've had a parent who struggled with substance abuse for years of the child rearing, and now that parent is, going through a sobriety process, right? Everybody should really center around that and feel, recognize the efforts that that parent's making to better themselves and to heal. So what we're talking about also is that every family is unique and different, and every therapeutic treatment needs to be suitable and meet the unique needs of those families.
Okay, so now how do you deal when you feel that it's unreasonable that the child is resisting? Is it a different process?
It is a different process. So again, the very first intervention that I always have is I really want to know what their former relationship looked like. Because if they had a foundation, if they had a secure attachment, if they had love towards each other, one of the interventions is to try to trigger those memories, right? That's one major intervention, because once those memories are brought out in the child and a child can remember all that, they often want to reconnect with that parent. right? Don't forget reunification therapy. We're talking about cases that go poorly that you see, but I see some of the wonderful success stories where parents and children have the opportunity to have a beautiful reunion with each other after some real hurt around a separation and divorce.
Okay, and maybe I'm jaded because I see a lot of the bad stuff. But one of the things you talked about is requiring the cooperation from the parent who the child has the relationship with. In my experience, I usually see resistance in one of two ways. One way is really obvious, and they're saying child should have nothing to do with the other parent, and they're kicking and screaming every step of the way. And the other one is the one that is smart enough to know I'm going to say I'm going to cooperate, but then doesn't really cooperate. And I'm assuming you see both of those. How do you deal with those two scenarios?
So I think that I really want to understand that parent, right? Like, what is the reason behind them not wanting to cooperate, or perhaps saying they're cooperating, but their actions aren't matching the level of cooperation that they're agreeing to, right? So I really want to understand that parent and what are the reasons why maybe they're clinging on too tightly to their child, maybe they're afraid of losing their relationship with their child, or maybe they're really angry at their ex-partner. So before kind of labeling them as the ultimate alienator, which isn't a good approach, I really want to understand what's going on with that parent.
And what type of success do you have with that? Because one of the comments a client will say to me, they're in my office, they have a really bad relationship with their child, or they're not seeing their child. And I say, well, I'm going to try and go get you an order for reintegration therapy. And then they're going to say to me, well, Andrew, okay, how much is this going to cost? And it's expensive. And then the process itself with people like you is expensive. And they say to me, what's the likelihood that if you get me the order I want, that my child's going to attend, or my children are going to attend, and that from that point forward, I'm actually going to end up with a relationship with my child? Do you have any sort of experience to say, anecdotally, how often you think it works?
I mean, I don't know if I have those numbers, right? I think those numbers are hard to assess and hard to gather, but what I can say is, again, I'm going back to that relationship before separation. And if there were indicators that there was love and that parent was bonded to the child, the success rate is going to increase, quite substantially, right? If it's more a moderate case or a less severe case of the parent-child contact problem where the child kind of sees the parent sporadically, right, but not following the court order, that's likely also going to make progress and have success in reintegration therapy. If there is cooperation between both parents and they've moved past that angry stage, around the separation, there's going to be progress. So there are some indicators that progress can happen, right? Again, the experience of the therapist, the empathy from the therapist, is all really important factors. The relationship that the child and the parents have with the therapist, all important factors to successful outcomes.
And I guess I look at things from a jaded perspective, because when I'm trying to get an order for someone like you to be involved, there's high conflict. There's clearly a lot of dislike between the parties, because when there's high conflict, that's generally the case. You're not going to be a big fan of the other side. And that says to me, you have a lot of challenges in the work that you do, because the part that I see the hardest is overcoming the resisting parent, whether they're alienating, which is one thing, or they're just undermining the process, may be something different, but ends up with the same overall result. And I think one of the hardest things you have to do is, how do you overcome that parent who is going to sit there and maybe acknowledge, well, it is important for the other parent and say the right things, but the moment they leave your office, behave in a very different way. Because I'm assuming that happens more times than people want to acknowledge, that they appreciate that what you may be doing will end up in front of a judge one day. And if it ends up in front of a judge, they want to be portrayed in a positive light. And I think that probably has to be one of the more challenging areas for you. So how do you as a professional deal with that? Because that's one of the questions I often get from my clients is, my spouse is smart enough to say all the right things and they're going to be really persuasive, but the moment they're going to leave, they're going to undermine it.
So a few things I would say to that. I would say early intervention is crucial. So the second that you have these high conflict individuals who appear slightly closed-minded walking into the office, walking into a lawyer's office, you may want to have a good conversation with them about a long journey that they have ahead, or can you get them into family therapy right away to mitigate this long journey. So it starts with the very first visit to the lawyer's office, because early intervention has much better outcomes. So and sorry, you asked another question, Andrew. So I go ahead with your other
No,
question.
that's okay. I'm noticing we're out of time now. The show went very fast because I think you provided some really good information for our viewers. And I hope they've gotten an idea about what parents can expect when dealing with issues of reintegration therapy and being excluded from a child's life, and an option. And sadly enough, when a parent is being excluded from their child's life, this really is the only option that you have to clinically try to fix it. And I'm not going to say to anybody it's a surefire success rate, because it's not. But sometimes you only have one option, and it's the best option at that point. And we're hoping that if our viewers want to watch more shows, they know they can visit us on separation.ca. The show will be posted on our Facebook page. The next show will be on September 24th at 12 noon. And if anyone has any requests for future shows, please email them to us at info@feldsteinfamilylaw.com. Thank you for joining us today, Joanna. It's much appreciated. And to our viewers, thank you for watching.
Thank you, Andrew.
Welcome.